There may be a hidden truth behind Karen Swift's disappearance that investigators spent years trying to uncover. On the morning after a Halloween party, the devoted mother of four simply vanished from her quiet Tennessee community. There were no signs of a struggle, no witnesses who saw her leave, and almost no evidence explaining where she had gone. Then, weeks later, investigators made a discovery that transformed a missing person case into a homicide investigation, eventually led detectives to a shocking conclusion. By the end, you may see this case from an entirely different perspective. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and join us as we uncover another investigation where the smallest detail changed everything. On the evening of October 30th, 2011, Karen Swift attended a neighborhood Halloween party in Dyersburg, Tennessee. Friends described the gathering as ordinary and enjoyable.
Karen laughed with neighbors, talked with friends, and appeared relaxed throughout the evening. Nothing about her behavior suggested that within a matter of hours she would disappear, launching one of the most controversial homicide investigations in Tennessee. For everyone who saw her that night, it seemed like just another weekend celebration before life returned to normal. Karen was 44 years old, the mother of 4 children, and well known throughout her community. She had built a life centered around her family and was involved in local activities that made her a familiar face in the area. Although her marriage had reportedly experienced difficulties, very few people believed anything serious was happening behind closed doors. Like many families, the Swifts appeared to be managing the normal challenges of marriage and raising children. No one imagined they would soon become the focus of a nationwide criminal investigation. According to the timeline later established by investigators, Karen returned home after the party during the early morning hours of October 31st. What happened after she arrived remains one of the most important questions in the entire case. At some point during the night, Karen left the house. Whether she left voluntarily, met someone outside, or was forced to leave would become the central mystery detectives spent years trying to answer.
The following morning, Karen failed to appear for commitments that friends and family expected her to attend. As the hours passed, concern quickly turned into alarm. Karen was known as a devoted mother who rarely disappeared without telling someone where she was going. Her cellular telephone was no longer answering, and nobody had heard from her since the previous evening. Those closest to her immediately recognized that something was terribly wrong. When investigators arrived at the Swift residence, they found very few obvious signs of a violent struggle. The home appeared relatively normal, and there was no immediate evidence suggesting that a crime had occurred inside. Cases like this often present enormous challenges because the absence of visible evidence can make it difficult to determine whether someone left voluntarily or became the victim of foul play. Detectives understood they needed to preserve every possible clue before making any assumptions. Search efforts began almost immediately. Law enforcement officers, volunteers, friends, and family members searched roads, wooded areas, nearby fields, and drainage ditches throughout the community. Search dogs were deployed, helicopters surveyed the surrounding countryside, and investigators followed every tip received from the public. Despite these extensive efforts, there was no trace of Karen. Each passing day increased fears that the investigation involved far more than a simple missing person case. As detectives reconstructed Karen's final known movements, they began interviewing everyone who had interacted with her during the days before she disappeared. Friends from the Halloween party described their conversations with her. Family members explained her recent activities and routines. Investigators carefully examined her financial records, telephone activity, and electronic communications, searching for anything unusual that might explain why she had suddenly vanished without warning. During those early interviews, detectives also learned that Karen's marriage had become increasingly strained in the months before her disappearance. Reports suggested the couple had experienced significant marital difficulties and were considering separation. While relationship problems alone do not indicate criminal activity, investigators know that understanding a victim's personal life is essential during any homicide investigation. As a result, detectives began taking a closer look at the people closest to Karen, including her husband. Even without physical evidence pointing towards a suspect, investigators recognized that time was working against them. Every hour increased the possibility that valuable evidence could disappear forever. Detectives expanded the investigation, collected surveillance footage whenever available, analyzed telephone records, and continued interviewing witnesses whose statements could help establish Karen's final timeline. They believed someone knew more than they were saying. For nearly 2 months, Karen Swift remained missing. Her family continued hoping she would somehow be found alive. while investigators quietly prepared for a much darker possibility. Then, just before the end of December, a discovery in a remote part of Dyer County would completely change the direction of the investigation and raise a question that would dominate the case for years. Was Karen Swift the victim of the perfect murder? Or had her killer made one fatal mistake? For nearly 2 months, investigators searched for Karen Swift without success. Volunteers combed fields, forests, abandoned roads, and waterways throughout Dyer County. Hundreds of tips poured in to law enforcement, but each promising lead eventually reached another dead end. As Christmas approached, hope that Karen might still be alive slowly faded. Detectives continued working every available lead, believing that somewhere beyond the growing silence, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. Then, on December 20th, 2011, everything changed. That afternoon, hunters exploring a remote wooded area near Bledsoe Cemetery made a horrifying discovery. Hidden among thick vegetation was the body of a woman in an advanced state of decomposition. Authorities immediately secured the area, recognizing that they had likely located the missing mother whose disappearance had dominated local headlines for weeks.
Crime scene investigators carefully photographed every inch of the location before recovering evidence that could later prove critical to the investigation. The remains were transported to the medical examiner's office, where forensic specialists worked to confirm the victim's identity. Shortly afterward, investigators officially announced that the body belonged to Karen Swift. The news devastated her family and transformed what had been a missing person investigation into a homicide case. Detectives now faced an entirely different challenge. Rather than searching for Karen, they had to determine exactly who had killed her and why. The autopsy revealed findings that immediately raised serious questions. According to the medical examiner, Karen's death had not resulted from natural causes or an accident. Instead, investigators concluded that she had been the victim of homicide. While certain details were never publicly released to preserve the integrity of the investigation, forensic evidence indicated that Karen had suffered injuries consistent with a violent assault before her body was abandoned in the isolated location where it was eventually discovered. The location itself became an important piece of evidence. Investigators believed the wooded area had not been chosen at random. It was remote, difficult to access, and unlikely to be visited frequently, making it an ideal location for someone attempting to conceal a crime.
Detectives carefully examined tire impressions, vegetation, soil samples, and every physical clue left behind. Even the smallest piece of evidence could help establish how Karen's body arrived there and who was responsible. Attention quickly returned to Karen's final known movements. Detectives reconstructed the hours between the Halloween party and her disappearance with even greater precision. They reviewed surveillance footage, analyzed cellular telephone records, examined financial transactions, and re-interviewed witnesses whose original statements might now carry greater significance. Investigators believed that once Karen's complete timeline was established, inconsistencies would begin to emerge. As detectives spoke with friends, neighbors, and family members, another picture slowly developed. Several witnesses described Karen's marriage as increasingly troubled during the months leading up to her disappearance. Reports suggested that the relationship between Karen and her husband, David Swift, had deteriorated significantly. Friends later told investigators that the couple had discussed separation and that tension inside the marriage had become difficult to ignore. While marital problems alone proved nothing, detectives knew they could provide important context. Investigators also examined David Swift's statements with extraordinary care.
Like every spouse in a missing person investigation, he was interviewed extensively about Karen's final hours, their relationship, and his activities during the night she disappeared. Detectives compared his timeline against telephone records, witness interviews, and forensic findings. As they continued reviewing the evidence, certain details began attracting increasing attention from investigators who believed parts of the timeline required closer examination. Despite growing public speculation, detectives remained careful not to reach premature conclusions. At that stage, they had no direct physical evidence conclusively linking any individual to Karen's death. Instead, investigators continued building their case methodically, allowing forensic evidence and verified facts to guide the investigation, rather than public opinion.
They understood that solving a homicide requires patience, especially when the available evidence is largely circumstantial. By the beginning of 2012, Karen Swift's disappearance was no longer a mystery about where she had gone. It had become a murder investigation focused on one critical question: who had both the opportunity and the motive to kill her? As detectives quietly assembled witness statements, forensic reports, and digital evidence, suspicion increasingly centered on the person who had known Karen better than almost anyone else. The investigation was about to enter its most controversial and decisive phase.
As the homicide investigation intensified, detectives focused on building a complete picture of Karen's final days. They revisited every interview, re-examined every piece of physical evidence, and carefully compared witness statements with digital records. Experienced investigators knew that homicide cases are rarely solved by a single dramatic discovery. Instead, they are built through hundreds of small facts that, when combined, reveal a consistent narrative. In Karen's case, that narrative gradually pointed investigators towards someone who had been at the center of the investigation from the very beginning. David Swift, Karen's husband, remained cooperative during the early stages of the investigation. Like any spouse in a missing person case, he was interviewed multiple times about his relationship with Karen, the events of Halloween weekend, and the timeline surrounding her disappearance. Detectives compared his statements with information gathered from friends, family members, and electronic records. While many details remained consistent, investigators identified several areas they believed required further examination, particularly concerning the hours after Karen returned home from the Halloween party. Friends and relatives painted a picture of a marriage that had become increasingly unstable. Several witnesses later testified that Karen had spoken openly about serious marital problems and had considered ending the relationship.
According to investigators, these conversations suggested that the couple had been living through months of emotional strain. Although relationship difficulties alone never establish guilt, detectives considered them an important factor when evaluating possible motives behind the homicide. Investigators also analyzed telephone records, financial activity, and the movements of both Karen and David during the days surrounding her disappearance. Digital evidence allowed detectives to reconstruct portions of the timeline with remarkable precision. Every telephone call, every transaction, and every confirmed sighting helped investigators eliminate certain possibilities while strengthening others. Rather than relying on speculation, detectives focused on facts that could be independently verified. The crime scene, where Karen's body had been discovered, also remained a critical source of information. Forensic specialists examined the surrounding area for biological evidence, trace materials, tire impressions, and any indication of how the body had been transported. Although exposure to weather over several weeks had degraded much of the available evidence, investigators still recovered information that helped them better understand how the crime had likely unfolded. Every forensic finding was carefully incorporated into the developing case. As months passed, detectives became increasingly confident that Karen's death had not resulted from a random act of violence. The available evidence suggested that whoever killed her likely knew her personally. There were no indications that she had been targeted by a stranger during an unexpected encounter. Instead, investigators believed the circumstances surrounding her disappearance pointed towards someone familiar with her daily routine, personal relationships, and movements on the night she vanished. Despite growing suspicion, prosecutors understood they needed far more than suspicion to secure a conviction. The investigation continued for years as detectives gathered additional witness statements, consulted forensic experts, and reviewed evidence repeatedly. Every major decision required careful legal review because investigators knew the eventual prosecution would face intense scrutiny. Building a homicide case based largely on circumstantial evidence demands extraordinary attention to detail. Public interest in the investigation remained high. Local media closely followed every development, while residents of Dyersburg debated competing theories about what had happened. Some believed investigators had correctly identified the person responsible. Others questioned whether enough evidence existed to support criminal charges. The case gradually became one of Tennessee's most widely discussed unsolved homicides, increasing pressure on law enforcement to deliver answers. Years passed before investigators believed they had assembled sufficient evidence to move forward.
The decision to seek criminal charges was not made quickly. Prosecutors carefully evaluated witness testimony, forensic reports, digital evidence, and the overall strength of the investigation before concluding that the case was ready for court. They believed the collection of evidence, viewed as a whole, established probable cause to hold someone accountable for Karen Swift's death. In 2018, nearly 7 years after Karen disappeared, authorities arrested David Swift and charged him with first-degree murder. The arrest marked the beginning of a new chapter in the investigation, but it did not end the controversy. David Swift denied responsibility for Karen's death, maintaining his innocence as the case entered the legal system. With investigators convinced they had identified the killer and the defense preparing to challenge every piece of evidence, the courtroom would become the place where years of investigation would finally be tested. Nearly 7 years after Karen Swift disappeared, the investigation finally entered its most important stage. Prosecutors believed they had gathered enough evidence to bring the case before a jury, while the defense insisted that investigators had built their theory on assumptions rather than undeniable proof. Unlike many homicide cases, there was no confession, no eyewitness who claimed to have seen the murder, and no single piece of forensic evidence that directly identified the killer.
Instead, the case depended on whether dozens of separate facts, when viewed together, pointed to one conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution argued that Karen's marriage had reached a breaking point long before Halloween weekend. Witnesses described increasing tension inside the relationship and testified that Karen had spoken about separating from her husband. According to prosecutors, the marriage had become deeply troubled, providing a possible motive for murder. They emphasized that while marital conflict alone never proves guilt, it became highly significant when combined with the timeline, witness testimony, and the circumstances surrounding Karen's disappearance. Investigators also presented evidence intended to show that Karen's disappearance was carefully staged. They argued that she had not voluntarily left her home during the early morning hours without contacting her children, family, or close friends. Detectives believed the available evidence was inconsistent with someone choosing to disappear on her own. Instead, prosecutors claimed that Karen's final movements suggested she had become the victim of a planned act of violence shortly after returning home from the Halloween party. The defense challenged nearly every aspect of the investigation. Attorneys argued that prosecutors had failed to produce direct evidence connecting David Swift to Karen's death.
They questioned witness credibility, disputed portions of the timeline, and emphasized that much of the state's case relied on circumstantial evidence rather than physical proof. According to the defense, investigators had focused too quickly on Karen's husband and interpreted later evidence through that assumption, overlooking alternative possibilities. Throughout the proceedings, forensic experts explained how evidence collected from the crime scene, Karen's body, and the surrounding investigation had been analyzed. Jurors heard detailed testimony about decomposition, the location where Karen's remains were discovered, and the challenges investigators faced after weeks of exposure to the environment. Experts carefully distinguished between conclusions supported by science and questions that simply could not be answered because of the condition of the evidence. Friends and family members also took the witness stand, offering emotional testimony about Karen's personality and the final months of her life. Some described her as a devoted mother who was preparing for major changes in her future. Others spoke about the strain within her marriage and conversations Karen had shared before her disappearance. While these accounts provided valuable context, jurors were repeatedly reminded that personal opinions could never replace factual evidence. As the trial continued, both sides presented dramatically different interpretations of the same investigation.
Prosecutors argued that the combination of motive, opportunity, witness testimony, and investigative findings established a compelling narrative of guilt. The defense maintained that unanswered questions remained throughout the case and warned jurors against filling those gaps with speculation. It became clear that the verdict would depend not on a single dramatic revelation, but on how the jury interpreted years of accumulated evidence. After hearing weeks of testimony and reviewing the evidence presented in court, the jury began deliberations. Karen Swift's family waited anxiously, knowing that the decision would shape the final chapter of an investigation that had consumed nearly a decade of their lives. Detectives who had worked the case for years also awaited the outcome, confident that the evidence supported the conclusions they had reached through countless hours of investigation. Ultimately, the legal proceedings concluded without a final determination of guilt. David Swift continued to maintain his innocence, and the case remained the subject of legal challenges and public debate. For many observers, the investigation highlighted the extraordinary difficulty of prosecuting homicide cases that rely heavily on circumstantial evidence. While investigators believed they had reconstructed what happened, the legal process demonstrated that proving those conclusions in court can be far more complicated.
Even today, Karen Swift's case continues to generate discussion among investigators, legal experts, and true crime researchers. It serves as a powerful reminder that criminal investigations and courtroom verdicts are not always the same thing. Detectives may become convinced they understand how a crime occurred, but the justice system requires evidence that meets an exceptionally high legal standard. That distinction is one of the reasons Karen Swift's story continues to fascinate people more than a decade after her disappearance. Karen Swift's disappearance remains one of Tennessee's most discussed criminal cases because it illustrates how some investigations continue raising questions long after the headlines disappear. More than a decade later, investigators, attorneys, and true crime researchers still examine the evidence, not because the case lacked effort, but because it demonstrates how complex homicide investigations can become when physical evidence is limited and the timeline depends heavily on witness testimony and circumstantial facts. One of the most important lessons from the investigation is the value of patience. Detectives did not solve Karen's disappearance overnight. They spent years interviewing witnesses, reviewing records, consulting forensic experts, and reconstructing every possible detail of her final known movements. Modern investigations are rarely solved by dramatic breakthroughs.
Instead, they depend upon persistence, careful documentation, and the willingness to revisit evidence that may initially appear insignificant. The case also highlighted the critical role of forensic science. Although investigators faced enormous challenges because Karen's body was not discovered for several weeks, forensic specialists still provided valuable information regarding the nature of her death, the location where she had been left, and the physical evidence that remained despite exposure to the elements. Scientific analysis did not answer every question, but it helped investigators distinguish verified facts from speculation throughout the investigation. Another lasting lesson involves the difference between suspicion and proof. Investigators may develop strong theories based on the available evidence, but criminal courts require those theories to be supported beyond a reasonable doubt. Karen Swift's case became a powerful example of that distinction. It reminded both investigators and the public that criminal investigations seek the truth, while court proceedings determine whether the available evidence satisfies the legal standard required for conviction. For Karen's children, family, and close friends, however, the investigation has never been about legal arguments or courtroom proceedings. They lost someone who played an irreplaceable role in their lives. Karen was remembered as a devoted mother, a caring friend, and someone who deeply loved her family.
Long after the media coverage faded, those closest to her continued living with the absence created by her disappearance and death. The investigation also changed the Dyersburg community. Residents who had once considered their town a place where violent crime was rare suddenly found themselves at the center of a nationally recognized homicide investigation. The case became a reminder that tragedy can occur even in communities where people know one another well. It also demonstrated how local law enforcement, forensic specialists, and prosecutors often work together for years in pursuit of justice. True crime researchers continue studying Karen Swift's case because it reflects many of the challenges investigators face in real life. Unlike fictional detective stories, real investigations rarely produce complete certainty. Evidence can be incomplete. Witnesses may remember events differently. Physical clues can disappear over time. Detectives must often make difficult decisions based only on the evidence that remains, rather than the evidence they wish they had. The story also reminds us to approach true crime with responsibility and respect. Behind every investigation is a real family whose lives were permanently changed. While courtroom proceedings and forensic evidence often become the focus of public attention, the true purpose of every homicide investigation is to provide answers, accountability, and dignity for the victim.
That principle guided investigators throughout Karen Swift's case and continues to shape criminal investigations across the United States today. Even now, Karen Swift's story continues to generate discussion because it raises timeless questions about justice, evidence, and the extraordinary challenges investigators face when reconstructing events that occurred behind closed doors. Whether viewed as a remarkable detective story or a heartbreaking family tragedy, the investigation remains an important chapter in Tennessee's criminal history and a reminder that the search for truth often demands years of unwavering dedication. Some cases are remembered because of the crimes themselves. Others are remembered because they reveal how difficult it can be to uncover the truth. Karen Swift's investigation belongs to both categories. It stands as a powerful example that every interview, every forensic examination, and every small piece of evidence has the potential to change the course of an entire investigation. Sometimes the truth is not hidden because it is impossible to find. Sometimes it simply takes years before every piece finally falls into place. Karen Swift left home after what should have been an ordinary Halloween weekend, never knowing that it would be the final chapter of her life. What began as a missing person investigation evolved into one of Tennessee's most complex and debated homicide cases.
Through years of detective work, forensic analysis, witness interviews, and relentless investigation, authorities worked to reconstruct the truth behind her disappearance. Although the case sparked years of legal debate and public discussion, it also demonstrated the extraordinary persistence required to pursue justice when answers are difficult to find. Karen's story remains a reminder that every investigation is built one piece of evidence at a time, and that behind every case is a family still searching for peace. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every subscription helps us continue bringing real investigations, forgotten cases, and the evidence behind them back into the light.